Okay, Vietnam. We gotta readjust this, and I've set it too far to do it from my chair. So, used to be, it wasn't often I would give up on a game. I seem to be doing that far too much recently. But in this case, it's a particularly weird situation. So, for example, Gloomhaven was a recent game I gave up on that, well, frankly, it wasn't impressing me. I just wasn't getting much out of it. And in the end, that's what's happening here too, or happened here, now that it's in the past. It feels like, I mean, there's people who have relationships that last less time than how long I spent playing this. That's not the first time in my life that's happened. But honestly, I have reached so I'm kind of trying to figure out, geez, am I changing fundamentally, which is a possibility in that I'm no longer able to devote myself to big games. But in honesty, I've never really played this for, the whole war. Usually I've given up far before. The one time that I finished a game, or I think I finished a game, I probably could have fixed the situation. And there's a fundamental reason for that, and that's what I want to get to here. Because I got to it in my rap, and I want to make sure I reiterate it here. Because this is a brilliant game. Overall, it's a masterpiece. I rate it highly for that. Do I want to play it again? Well, in the Board Game Geek ratings, if I followed their instructions, this would probably rank around a 3 or a 4. Which doesn't mean I would never touch it again. I probably would play it opposed again. But I doubt I'm ever going to solo it again. And not because it's hard to solo particularly, although if I play it again, I want to be the VC, because screw it, I'm tired of the US, at least for now. So nobody who doesn't know the game well should even think about asking me. But yeah, I mean, if somebody in my neighborhood were to say, hey, you want to stop over twice a week and, spend a few hours each week playing Vietnam, as the VC, I'd be like, yeah, if I can smoke and drink coffee and whatever, but I don't want it taking up my house. And but that's it. Yeah, I do think that it's a brilliant game. At heart, my fundamental problem with it is what I discussed in the rap, is that it does everything that I'd want a big strategic game to do, by digging down deep, by getting into all the details. But those details become tedious and repetitive. And that tediousness and repetitiveness blinds you to that overall strategic view. Or blinds me. I think there may be people who can take both sides of it and grasp it in a way. And that's the one big flaw that gets in my way and prevents me from coming up and being excited about playing and keeping that excitement. There's also the fact that, and this relates to that tediousness, and I didn't catch this in the rap, although I've certainly said it before, figuring out what you're going to do requires kind of assessing that whole strategic view, and then digging down individually into, do I have an opportunity to do something here? No, I don't. I want to put that on hold until later in the turn. Let me find something that I can do, that I need to do, but maybe my opponent will feel a requirement to do something, and that'll take one of his reserves off, or whatever, just in order to lighten the burden that of my decision making. As you get late in any given turn, most of the pieces have moved, and you have very few decisions, and it becomes fairly easy to actually just settle down and start making decisions. But towards the beginning of a turn, and I stopped this one towards the beginning of a turn, it's really, really painful to keep reassessing, okay, where is the action that I actually feel like I need to do next? And I don't feel like it's terribly easy, although I'm forced to do this, to work your way down the map and say, okay, can I do this? Because you keep coming to places where, yeah, in this sector I want to do something, but if I do it, I'm giving something up. So let me see, is there something that is more important? So you really do have to assess all the individual parts of the big map early on in each turn. And that is, again, part of this dynamic of big strategic decisions being made, and then you dig down, not just to the operational level that you're used to in like an OCS type game, at least that I'm used to. Some people might find the same paralysis, and maybe I would if I play any of the big ones. I have some of the big ones, and I'm a little afraid of them. But so far in my OCS games, I haven't been paralyzed to this level where I have to reassess every stack, and there's many, many stacks. This game also has a lot of forces spread out all over the place. You're covering everything. As the US and SVN, you're trying to protect everything, and the VC is trying to attack everything. And where opportunities arise, that's where you have to grab them. So you have this kind of combination of the detail and the strategic at the same time. The strategic ends up getting lost, and so that overall picture of how's the war going doesn't really come to you until you're doing the end of the season and you're like, oh, I didn't do too bad this turn, or wow, I got hosed, or right. All right, components, because whatever. I think the map is absolutely beautiful. Victory Games, though, printed on a high quality stock, and that creates a bit of pooch. It's sort of a mixture. I didn't have too much trouble with this one. I had it taped down with my reusable tape, even though the map has obviously been taped. That was prior to my getting it. I had learned my lesson on another game already. The counters, standard Victory Games quality. They're readable. They contain the information you need. There's no problem with them. The graphic design feels like Redmond Simonson just continued on with Victory Games, which he didn't, but Victory Games tended to put out very, very good quality stuff. They had learned their lessons from the SPI days. And probably not enough of these ops complete markers, but again, you can kind of make do, which I've managed to do using various things. There's some other things where there's like, you come up with, and this happens in every game, every big game, you come up with, oh gee, it would be useful to know this, and you end up using, maybe like Tiddlywinks or something like that to cover certain things. A lot of paperwork in this game. I find that I need this to have a picture of what's going on, and I track the population on here. And then you have the actual population sheet where you're tracking things in a way that's easier to deal with mathematically. Just you're just doing some bookkeeping basically, but whatever. So one for the visual, one for the math, and I feel like I need both. You have these record sheets. The NLF record sheet is not detailed enough to track all the information quite as well as I would like it to. I find that, you can get everything in there, but I find that there's some carryover. There's some places where I wish that they had carryover, where you added up and got a carryover instead of just bringing it to the next season in and add up. Or maybe the US sheet is too detailed, but it has so much more information. I can understand where the decision was made to cut the NLF record sheet to something smaller so you could get more seasons in, and you get one extra season in on there by reducing that. This one, they reduced the type, the point size, and that ended up, working pretty well, actually. Okay. You got a couple of charts for the players. Do they have everything you need? Yeah, for the most part. They have your combat charts, and they have your strategic purchases and whatnot in there. You get a chart to determine your population changes. And the rule book itself is well written. This is not a trivial game to learn, though. It's got some very innovative concepts, certainly, especially at its time. It had the pulsed movement, where one person gets to, the VC basically gets to choose who goes. Do I go? Okay, and then you get a choice to go, the US gets a choice to go, and then the VC gets to trump that in, and otherwise the turn ends. So both players have to basically say the turn's over, but the US doesn't really know if the VC is going to basically take their final, I still want to do stuff this turn. So, what about the basic systems? So, the funny thing is, as an operational game, if you just stripped away the strategic game, it's much more manageable and probably an enjoyable little operational exercise that would take you a day or two to play out. Even maybe, almost any of the regular scenarios. And it's interesting enough on that to justify buying the game if you're not a crazy person who believes that, well, if I'm not playing the strategic game, why should I bother? Which is unfortunately my problem. So the core of the actual play of the game throughout, whether you're playing strategic or the operational scenarios, is based on that pulsing and the VC controlling the pulsing. So any given turn begins with an ability for the U.S. to strategically redeploy at the beginning of the turn. Now there's 2 turns per season, and most of the scenarios are just 2 turns long. That means because you can't go beyond that without getting into the strategic side of things. Then you get to pre-deploy a bunch of forces as well, in terms of, hey, I want these forces on hold or patrol patterns in order to better defend a location or to prevent enemy movement through the area. Both of which can be valuable. I found myself probably underusing patrols by a lot. I certainly got accused of that. It's hard for me to say when I'm on, generally a search and destroy mode as the U.S. to say, I really want to restrict NLF movement, and then when I'm on the defending against an offensive, I'm like, I want those reserves available to defend the important stuff. So it's very hard for me to commit something to just slowing the enemy down. You have to do that in this game, and I'm bad at it. And it's one of the reasons probably my U.S. player has struggled in the past, and even in this game, I still don't use it very much at all. Then, whichever player is going to go does an operation, and they define the target of the operation, they define the forces that are going to be involved, and they define the type of operation they're going to do. For the VC, there's basically 2 things that they like to do. Well, they might do a special operation to decide that they're going to hold. I haven't seen them patrol yet. That seems pretty iffy. Although patrolling along the roads can really screw up U.S. strategic movement if that's an issue. because you can't just clear those guys out of there using security operations, which is part of this strategic movement phase as well. You have a basic choice, but in general, I found myself doing the search and destroy operation, which is the basic, go contact the enemy and run them down and kill them. There might be times when, hold on. Okay. My wife had flopped down to avoid making noise. I'm hoping not much noise gets up here to the camera, but it's hard to tell. It certainly gets into my ear. Okay. So, in general, I do the search and destroys because, well, for the U.S. player, getting that body count up was one of my major strategic goals. There are times, though, when the NLF was able to retreat out of the general area I'm operating in because their retreat movement is quite fast sometimes if you don't have enough interdiction and enough patrols and such on. And the capability to pin them down is not absolute. But what I found was I was hoping to squish little things, and throwing too many resources into trying to trap them into place was just too expensive. Now that might change as the NLF, as the VC themselves start withering away. That's the point that I never really got to. They were beginning to get expensive, but they hadn't yet gotten to the point where, yeah, I really can't afford to maintain them, which might happen. I've heard people talk about the game, or write about it. No, I've seen people write about the game in a manner which seems to indicate that at some point or another the game switches over and you're largely trying to interdict the NVA from crossing and hurting you. There would still be VC units floating around because there's always 4 political sections that show up every turn. And I assume to cover those and make those a little less vulnerable, you're going to have to put some points into keeping the VC alive. So the U.S. still has to try to, I would imagine, has to try to protect the internal areas as well still. Plus, I mean, you get such if the U.S. isn't protecting the internal areas, there's such an advantage to attacking them that the values go up, and if they are protecting them, well, maybe you don't invest quite as much, but you're weakening them because they're spread out all over the damn place. Strategic movement can make some difference to that. I've never gotten to that stage of the game. I have always been in the stage where, hey, there's VC that I can attack just about anywhere I want to be. It's just how good's the terrain to attack them. So one of the big things is the VC have the capability to kind of slip away, and even if you do manage to catch one that you can kill easily, it might just disappear and go on to the replacements track over here. So it's kind of frustrating, you know? You finally get something, you get enough firepower to pin it into place, and yep, just melts away. Every now and then, though, you will run into something that you can't really fight, especially when you're in the rougher terrains where there's big defensive bonuses, and the VC may be able to slip away, may not have to slip away as easily. They may be able to stand and fight until you bring in such overwhelming odds of reinforcements, if you want to, or just call the damn thing off because you're taking too many losses. You don't want to trade casualties with the VC, that's for sure, and probably not with the NVA either. The actual combat situation of the game, well, I mean, more happens in the combat than just fighting. What I found with it was when there are real battles, like between, if the NLF has reasonable amounts of forces, I had to write down and use a lot of pen and paper action to keep track of what's going on in the fight. Because it goes several rounds and the strengths are changing as there's losses or additional forces being brought in. So that all becomes kind of cumbersome, but it's kind of fun too. Honestly, I find the mechanisms of the game fun, which is why I find it so hard to understand why that's not enough to keep me going through this monstrous strategic view that I get every now and then. This used to be the kind of thing, well, I think it still is, but I'm not sure anymore. But the concept behind this, go into detail, fight the battles out, do lots of little stuff, and then step back and look at that overall situation. The problem is this never, because it's a counterinsurgency, it never has these fixed borders. I don't get to look at it and really picture what's going on the strategic level in any real way. The only thing I get to do is look at, well, how's the population falling out, and what are my casualty numbers? What's my morale like? I'm looking at numbers rather than some kind of board position that I can really grasp. And maybe for me, at least, coin is just not something that I should be playing at this level of detail. Okay. Anything exciting more about the basic operations in the game? See if I found security was a lot less effective than I used to think. It's great if you're clearing the road, like if the NLF is just all over the road for some reason. But even then, you run out of movement points, and you start taking casualties at an ugly level unless you devote a lot of force to it. Now, one thing with the security operation, if they're all over the road, you can devote a lot of air power to that, or you probably don't... artillery can move fairly fast on the road, too, so it's not too bad. But usually what I use is armor in conjunction with air power, because the armor moves faster than the artillery. And then the air power can be used in multiple attacks. But here's the thing. The NLF can just run off the road when you hit them. So yeah, you've cleared the road, but you have not hurt them badly. It's not like the search and destroy operations. You're not going to get body bag count. Also, my NLF was not interdicting the road the way they have it in other games that I've played of this. So we saw less of that going on than before. When I did try to use it against big stacks, boy was I disappointed, because I've committed a lot of firepower to trying to knock a big stack off the map. It's useful in the offensives, though, where those big NVA units are coming in. If you can run in and smash them, this requires invading, which has a morale cost, but if you can run in and smash them off the road, you make it much, much harder for them to perform the operation that, at least in the first season, they're out of position now, and you can take some of the attacks out of the way by devoting some forces to that operation. Firepower, really, really important, because the way firepower works in this is, yes, it adds to your odds chart, and odds chart is important. That gives you column shifts on the combat table. The combat is actually quite brilliant. I love the way it works in concept. So it gives you modifiers to the die roll, essentially, using the odds as the modifier. And the terrain gives you a modifier to the table. And then the losses are based on how big the force you're hitting is. So a big force being hit with good odds can be hurt pretty badly. Now, there are limits to how much artillery counts towards odds, though. But The artillery doesn't count towards your own casualties. So like if you have artillery units in, you don't add them to the size of your force. You add them to the size of your opponent's force. So they they increase your odds, and they cause the enemy to be on a bigger chart in terms of the casualties they're going to take. So if you hit them properly, you can do a lot of damage to them. Air power counts as artillery. The difference with air power is you have to commit it right at the beginning of the operation. And that can be difficult because you don't know what you're facing when you commit the air power. Air power is actually very much not something you can just call on, but nearby artillery is, which is a little weird. Navy is kind of like air power, except it's limited in where it can hit. It can only hit near the coast, and it comes in chunks. The battleship New Jersey has 16 points of air power, of firepower. The cruisers have 6 points each. It's not a whole lot, but the cruisers aren't a whole lot. And if you use it in conjunction with air power, one of the risks to using air power or air mobility, something else I haven't touched upon, is you will potentially lose a support point each operation. Which, because the game is essentially attritional on the strategic game, this is something that you have to be very careful about. Okay. Again, you have the capacity to interdict, which is important in trying to pin the enemy into place so you can actually eliminate him instead of him running away. By moving into the enemy's hex, you're able to prevent him from moving away as easily, but you're also restricting your own ability to necessarily get out of the battle, and you may lose the units that you throw into the enemy's hex. The US has a restriction on their firepower capability. If they don't declare a region free fire, their firepower support is halved, and that's very expensive. But there's a big cost to making a place free fire. When you make a place free fire, it's going to affect the strategic population support, and you have to kind of weigh, how many attacks am I going to do? So there's a little bit of pre-planning in that. Okay. So you have 2 movement special capabilities, Air Mobile and Riverines. Riverines are pretty cool. You never lose them. They really help you control 4th Corps, but they're kind of expensive, and the amount of Riverines and the amount of force that you have down in 4th Corps can shift the entire battle into the north. The 4th Corps region terrain is mainly cultivated in swamps, neither of which are particularly bad neither of which give particularly high defensive bonuses. Cultivated not at all for the NLF, and swamps are a -1. The cultivated has a bonus for the US support in that there's more of the population that you can call up to help you in terms of militia. And there's also a lot of towns and stuff in there, which, again, if you're holding them as the U.S. player, it makes them hardened targets. Something that I don't see getting attacked too often in my play, but I'm being encouraged that the NLF should probably be trying to pick off weak towns and such, not just to affect the population a little harder. Okay, air mobilization, though, is the biggie. Air mobilization allows you to take most units and make them much, much more maneuverable, especially in terms of you can turn artillery into able to pursue, which is a really big advantage. But also, it just reduces the cost of movement. But the cost to air mobilizing units is you have a limited quantity of air mobile points to begin with, and you probably will lose one in any operation that goes on for any length of time. Like if you're making a few die rolls, you almost certainly will lose one because, well, Not if you have overwhelming force, but if you're making a number of die rolls, you lose them based on these little helicopter markers, just like you lose air points based on little air markers. The different deployments for the US units, you're able to deploy them in different formats. There's a little bit of advantage to gathering the whole force together. You get a slight pursuit advantage, although the actual, I think the movement point value is less, but it's pursuit that's important. But the problem with that is you're a lot less flexible in terms of what you can do with them. What I found as the best deployment, or the deployment that I like the most, is no headquarters and just spread the artillery out among things. Get my firepower somewhere else if I need it, and I always need it. Even with the headquarters, I'm going to need it. And the pursuit bonuses are the worst in that format, though, which means you need more firepower to interdict. In the gathered together format, that tends to be more valuable when you're facing the enemy in rough terrain. Once you take the battle to the enemy in the north, you want that high pursuit modifier, and you know you need the whole regiment together in order to fight. The cost of this is deployment happens only during the strategic interphase. So if you've got big units deployed together, then maybe the NLF runs into the terrain where they're more susceptible to little unit attacks. And if you have little units all spread out, they go hide in the mountains. So you're stuck with this kind of, that flexibility is important, but it's hard to use. The NLF, the VC units are all hidden, and this is a huge, huge issue. I find playing solitaire, because of the limited amount of time that I spend playing, it's really easy to forget what's where. In fact, far easier than it should be. I could see it being possible when playing solo, if you played kind of, and I did a few days where I did this, where you play pretty concentrated, where you have a pretty good idea of what's going on. But honestly, that idea of what's going on is probably no better than the idea of what's going on when you're playing it opposed. If you face a unit, you know what it is. And I don't find myself too often looking at VC units and saying, now I gotta remember to attack that, when they're not doing anything. And its behavior can kind of give you a hint as to what it is. Of course, there could be some bluffing in there. Oh, boy. Okay, let me check how far we are on the battery, because, yeah, this is a big game. It deserves, let's swap out. Okay. I should have got more coffee. So, what's we got here? Arvin Rangers. Rangers are weird. They're really, really expensive. If you're not planning on using Arvin units at all, it's kind of painful to throw them into a battle, because they give the VC an additional alert movement. But by kind of surrounding enemy units or blocking their movement with the Rangers, you can really make it so that it's hard for the VC to get away. But you only get them on like a random roll. The more Rangers you have, the more likely you'll be to get them, and the more likely you'll be to get more of them too. But like I said, they're very, very expensive. So it's a hard call, mainly on the strategic side, whether or not you want them. I like them, but I could see going with firepower solutions instead. The nice thing about Rangers is they might show up anytime you declare an operation as the US. Okay, that's the sort of operational game, the core of it. And I have never played one of the moderate scenarios. I've played tiny little scenarios to see, there's like one or two little ones, just to show you how the mechanisms of the game work. But then there's some larger ones that are full season, and I've always looked at that and said, hey, it's just, that's too small. I want the whole picture, and it probably is too small for my taste. But again, I think for most people who aren't, I think they provide an interesting option for something you can play and get this kind of operational view of the game on a limited map with limited objectives, where you're really trying, you're playing the game at the level at which it's kind of designed at. But there's this whole strategic overlay, which I find the more interesting thing, because I'm not really an operational, especially modern, type of gamer. So what happens in the strategic phase? Well, here's where the game gets really interesting to me. First of all, depending on how the VC is active in an area, you end up rolling over all of this, I'm sure, but looking at the things helps bring my mental processes together. I don't know if I can find them. Yeah, my rulebook is in horrible shape. This is part of the rulebook, for example. I think, maybe not. Yeah, it looks like it. You roll for each province, whatever, I don't know what they're called. Each region, each population region, you roll to see whether or not the population changes. And the more VC activity there, and the better they're doing in that area, the more likely the population is going to turn against the U.S. But if you're able to clear the area of VC for the most part without free firing it or anything violent, there's a good chance that it'll slowly improve. So that's kind of what your strategic goal is to keep the population that's allied with the SVN or aligned with them high. And that's good for the SVN itself, and it's basically your victory conditions. Then in the strategic war segment, you are allowed to bomb the north and the trail. You bomb the north in order to reduce production that the NVA has, and you bomb the trail in order to reduce its status and prevent the NVA from filtering as much troops and point and supplies through it. Now, I left the trail alone. If you hit the trail hard, you can actually damage it. But it takes a lot of firepower to do that. And it takes a fair amount of firepower to reduce the trail. If the trail gets reduced enough, the NLF can start shipping supplies by sea, and then you have to worry about sea interdiction. What I did instead was just bomb the north. And I didn't bomb it too hard, but I bombed it every turn with limited bombing campaign, because that helps SVN morale, which I found very important and had to keep up. And it does hurt US morale, but it's doing two good things for, as long as you're doing limited bombing, I felt like the cost was reasonable. The more severe bombing, the unlimited bombing or whatever, where you're hitting Ho Chi Minh City and stuff, well, that always looked too expensive to do, because I never like spending US morale. It's my money in the game. You don't take my money away ever, which is, again, the factor with the with my ramp up. I don't know if I talked about it here yet, but yeah. You determine what points the NVA gets in, and then and then before you start building units, you go to a political phase where essentially the U.S. has some control over, but you're determining how well the SVN officers are dealing with you, and they might not be effective, which means they basically can't do shit. You're not able to use the divisions have their own commanders, and if that division is inactive, you're not able to use it. And then the corps commanders have the reserve forces that the SVN uses, and you may not be able to use that. And I may have said NBA instead of SVN at some point there. I'm not sure. There's a possibility of a coup happening. The U.S. can try to cause the coup. That causes real problems for the SVN, but you might be able to replace a problematic commander-in-chief on the SVN side. Then, after some bookkeeping, both sides buy their units. Now, the U.S. Buys its units out of, basically it's able to reach its morale factor. Once it reaches its morale factor, it can never buy any more units, and it starts having to cut back. In addition to just paying points of your morale, essentially, your morale goes down as well. So you've got a pool of morale value and an amount of commitment. And if the commitment reaches the morale, well, you can't buy anymore. But if you ramp your commitment up too much, the morale goes down. The morale can go down from other reasons too, like bombing the North. You will have to continuously be spending commitment because, and no matter what the situation is, you will have to keep committing because you'll need to buy replacement points, you'll need to buy new air and air mobile points. So even if you've got everything under control, you will constantly have a drain on what you have. So that's where this becomes kind of an attritional game. The U.S. has a limited amount of commitment that they're willing to do throughout the game. The NVN, on the other hand, has the same kind of thing, a morale and a commitment, but they bring their commitment up to their morale, and their morale just keeps boosting. So they just keep being able to continually build more and more, and that accelerates. It's a curve going up. It's not, it's not a linear acceleration. It's a little bigger than that. Maybe a lot bigger than that. Yeah, not a lot. I think it's logarithmic, probably. Just a guess. So it's not a huge ramp up, but it's bigger than you would expect. Now, for the NLF, NVA units are always a fixed cost, but your VC units start getting more expensive as you use up the population. You have to start smuggling fighters in from North Vietnam. The revolt in South Vietnam actually peters out, and now you need to get more manpower in. So initially, you're able to just send supplies down to the locals, but as the game goes on, you have to start sending troops in along with supplies to be the locals, to pretend to be locals. See if there's anything else I want to talk about here. Yeah, there's the Free World Allies, which I consider kind of shitty. Most of them, if you have to pay for them, they're usually pretty bad. But the free ones are kind of cool. ARVN, this is the South Vietnamese army. It needs supplies from the U.S., which means commitment from the U.S., and those supplies end up kind of giving an overview of the rules here and not giving too much, because honestly, it all is beautiful. It really fucking is. The ARVN supplies end up being a drain on the U.S., but they also cannot have more manpower. Like the VC, they have a limit to the amount of manpower that they can commit to their troops. And this is actually something that worries me if you start controlling too little of the country, you can't build new troops and replacements. You're just screwed. And that was actually something I was beginning to worry about, that I wouldn't have the capability to put Arvid in control of the game. So the U.S. eventually would get to a point where they've reached their morale with their commitment. And now they have to start withdrawing units. And they get commitment back as they withdraw units. Now, one of the nice things is, if you buy your units in a certain way, you get some free units that you get commitment back for when you withdraw them. So that's kind of cool. Right. In terms of accuracy, it's really hard for me to judge. But there is one flaw that I saw, and I had confirmed, which is, and this is one of the things that bothers me about like La Grande Guerre as well, and maybe Balance of Power, which is that there's a scenario, the Tet scenario, that you could not physically reach the numbers using the game that are present in that scenario. Which to me means there's something going on in the game that is not mapping to the reality. And that I find very bothersome. It should be physically possible to make choices that would get you to those Tet numbers. And either what's being represented as the Tet scenario is just plain wrong, which I find highly unlikely because you can do research and figure out what is supposed to be represented there, or the game system is failing in a massive way. And it's that latter thing that kind of bothers me. Now, this is not why I stopped playing by any means. That's the kind of thing that actually seems to spur me on to try to reach those levels. I know with La Grande Guerre, it took me a while to really determine, you know what, this game cannot reach the historical level. So all of this fits together, and it creates what I think is really a brilliant, brilliant design that I like playing for a while. I love the grand scope of it, and I like the detail, and I like the shifting between that really, really detailed view up to this grand view. But there's a few things that get in the way. I'm not sure which one is the killer blow. Maybe it's the combination of them. But between not having a really good strategic picture of the game, and that may be my own mental incapacity, similar to how I have trouble figuring out, naval games. Just because there's no front line, those things just they don't make sense to me in my mind. Just like that, with this, I've got this sort of mixed view of the entire. I have all these little pieces that are tactical views, and I never really absorb the strategic view from it. And that may be something about, saying something about my mind or whatever, right? Rather than about the game itself. But the game does not make it easy for me to see that strategic view. It also may be something to do with the fact that, there isn't a front line. There is nothing to really picture in the way that I like to think about things with, I own this much territory. Yeah, I have control of some areas in the middle, but everything else is kind of fluid. And that's just hard for me to grasp. Kind of goes against that zoning out on the map and enjoying the game in a certain way. So in the end, what ended up happening is there was too much repetitive tedium that didn't seem to do much. Like no operation was just like, oh my God, the game is over now, or anything like that. I mean, obviously, if Saigon falls, that happens, but nothing is really high value that I saw. Nothing led me to be like fantasize about the game for the next, overnight. And yet there were just these continual, again and again, draining down this attritional warfare handled at this level of detail that, became just too much. And when it comes down to it, I think the best thing I could have done was admitted months ago that, yeah, I'm not playing this. Luckily for me, I half admitted it and, threw out some other videos and played some other games. And we're going to get back to a choo-choo game just for Robin, because I know he wants to watch me play another 18xx game so much. It's what I'm in the mood for right now. I just have bad news for you guys. But yeah, there's an opportunity cost to playing this too. It's any huge game, but if it's not sparking real joy in me, I probably am wasting my time in doing it. There are other things I want to take a look at, other things I want to do. Honestly, when I was first playing around with this, I kept looking at Europe in Turmoil and being like, wow, I wish I was playing that instead. Because I was really, looking at the pieces of that again, I was really in the mood to break that out and play it instead. There's just too many games for me to spend my time on something that was only feeling like a chore. Which, it's nothing against the game design. I think the game design is very, very... It's not just very good. It's also right up where I would... Like, if I could design a game, I feel like it would be something like this. I would be trying to capture that kind of thing, which is probably why I should never design games, because I wouldn't like what I made. It just wouldn't catch my interest somehow, I think. So, even though I don't like playing this, even though I've never really been caught by it, I feel like it's so, I don't know, it's so impressive. It almost stuns me that I don't like it, is the problem. Or that I don't... It's not even that I don't like it, because I do like it. I like setting it up. I like the strategic phase. I like the operational stuff for a while. It's just, it wears on me. And you know what else did that? Playing out all the battles to SFB. It was a very similar situation. Not to SFB. Playing out the SFB battles to Federation and Empire. At first, I would set it up. I have this fantastic strategic thing. The individual battles are interesting. They're SFB battles. That's great. And then they just start looking the same each time. Again and again and again. And there's nothing that interesting happening in any specific battle that you're like, well, that was, really key to the game. Instead, what you were just doing was grinding onward again and again. And I kind of feel like, that was something I never finished, very obviously. I would get through 6 years of that, 8 years of that, and then be like, I've just spent most of a year playing this, and it's going to take me the rest of my life to finish it. This wouldn't be that long. It's not on the same scale, but it's having the same impact. And maybe the individual payoff, the payoff to the battles is not the same. The payoff to an SFB battle is quite high to me. The payoff to playing out one of these, not so high. And then the image of what I get back was very similar, which is, okay, I took a base and fed an emp. Okay, I killed a unit. All right. That's enough for this. I think that the strategic game definitely plays better to other people, but it just didn't do it, and never really has. There's another game. It's funny because gotta keep talking. I don't know why. When I was trying to choose this, there was another game that's been on my mind in the same sort of way that I have never played out. Now, I don't enjoy it as much, but I went out and actually bought the additional, the games that aren't quite of the series and then made components. This is SPI's Central Front series, which I don't consider anywhere near as brilliant, but that's another one where it maybe kind of catches for me. I kind of start enjoying it. Not to the level I enjoy this at its best. And then I just realized, wow, it's just going on and on and on. And it's just so fucking boring. That one at least has front lines. All right, let's send this up.